X-Men Schism was a 2011 comic book miniseries that saw Wolverine and Cyclops come to blows over their differences in opinion on sending children into dangerous situations, such as a Sentinel about to attack the X-Men's home. It ended with Wolverine returning to New York City with some other X-Men to start a new school that focuses on teaching the kids and not turning them into soldiers, while Cyclops remained on Utopia Island, where, as far as he was concerned, mutants were soldiers in the army of the X-Men and were needed in the fight to come. Normally, I don't like hero versus hero stories. They're often lazy. One or more characters have to be written contrary to their usual characterization just to make the preordained story happen, while the intent is for the audience to root for both sides because they're both supposed to have a valid point in whatever the conflict is. Almost always, I end up rooting against both sides because they're acting like emotionally arrested toddlers. But in the context of where the X-Men were at the time this story came out, and because of the aftermath, I wasn't against the idea of splitting up the X-Men based on this conflict of ideology. I wasn't against the idea, but the execution works on no level. The X-Men has always been about training child soldiers to carry out the dreams of a madman. X-Men issue 1. All of the X-Men are teenagers, probably about as old as Oya and Hope, who Wolverine doesn't want going up against the Hellfire Club or Sentinels. Why does Wolverine only take issue with Cyclops doing what the X-Men has always been about now? Not only is this central in how the X-Men operate, but how Wolverine operates. In Uncanny X-Men issue 195, Wolverine elected 13-year-old Kitty Pryde to lead the team. Wolverine, of all people, takes issue with Cyclops sending teenagers into combat. How many child sidekicks has Wolverine had over the years? There's Kitty Pryde, Jubilee, X-23, maybe not a sidekick outright, but Wolverine did include her in the X-Force kill squad not long before this story. Even though she's nearly unkillable, girl has some trauma she hadn't worked through. Probably wasn't a good idea to recruit her into a team of assassins. Not to mention, it wasn't that long ago Wolverine was telling Nightcrawler he would follow Cyclops no matter what. That wasn't written by the man who wrote this story. At the time that comic came out, nobody knew this story would happen a few years later. But it's weird when a character displays extreme loyalty and in such a short amount of time is ready to tear out his leader's throat. The conflict does not work with Wolverine versus Cyclops. Since this story was written by Jason Aaron, who also wrote the Wolverine and the X-Men run following this event, I can see why Aaron chose Wolverine. If he tried to replace Wolverine with someone else in Schism, Wolverine and the X-Men wouldn't have the same energy. Wolverine is a brawler. He's the last person you would expect to become headmaster of a school. Putting anyone else against Cyclops would not have the same effect because whoever you choose isn't a wild brawler, so the juxtaposition isn't as extreme in your spin-off book. But much as I love Wolverine and the X-Men, if we're looking at the integrity of the story of Schism, Wolverine has to go as the moral nemesis of Cyclops. When you're plotting a story and you have an endgame in mind, in this case putting Wolverine in charge of a new school, the journey to that endgame is just as important as the endgame itself. If the journey doesn't make sense, the endgame feels hollow. But it's not enough for me to point out the flaws of this story. I'm also arrogant enough to think I could come up with a better solution. Bear in mind this is with a decade of hindsight, and I'm not juggling other ongoing books in addition to writing a miniseries and planning another ongoing. So who would fight Cyclops? I thought of a few choices who might work for different reasons. My first option was Storm, who fought Cyclops in the 1980s when they both thought they were the best choice to lead the X-Men. Since then, they've gotten along pretty well. In fact, even though I'd say Storm is closer with Wolverine, after this story, she chose to stay with Cyclops. But Storm has always been pretty against killing. So instead of the conflict between her and Cyclops stemming from using children in combat situations, it specifically stems from Cyclops ordering Oya to commit murder. Oya was the closest thing to an innocent the X-Men had at the time, and Storm can see how this wrecks Oya after she does this, and it reminds Storm of her own turmoil. We cannot put someone like Oya in a situation like this. It's not that she's underage, it's that she's clearly not combat material. This will screw with her in a big way. So Storm establishes a new school as an alternative to the war Cyclops is grooming everyone for. Cyclops wouldn't like that. We're stronger if we stick together, but Storm reminds him she is not his prisoner, and some of the students want to be just that, students. Or you could do Cyclops versus Magneto, who had been with the X-Men for about a year by this point. Instead of the story being about using kids in the field, it'd likely be about how far Cyclops is willing to push back against humanity for production and distribution of Sentinels, machines designed explicitly to kill their kind. Cyclops just made a speech to the United Nations asking them to tear down their Sentinel factories. Then, thanks to the manipulation of the Hellfire Club, the UN gets attacked and Sentinels are all over the place. Magneto would see Cyclops' actions as too soft. You're only targeting the Sentinels, but the humans who built them get a stern talking to? I don't like this as much, since this would be a lot like the arguments between Charles Xavier and Magneto over the years. Plus, Magneto hadn't been with the X-Men for very long, so him and Cyclops coming to blows would only endanger his being on the side of the heroes again, which is where I prefer to keep him. Plus, if the desired effect is to split the X-Men decision among two ideologies, nobody is going to follow Magneto if he says Cyclops isn't doing enough. He'd have to have been with the X-Men for like 15 continuous years leading up to this for me to buy that any of the other X-Men would follow him. Another option was Cyclops versus Cable. This would be tricky. For one, Cable died in the Second Coming story before this event, so you'd have to bring him back to life, and preferably you would want it to feel like he wasn't just brought back to fight his dad. And if you want to go with the children being sent into battle as the crux of the conflict, Cable is the one who transformed the New Mutants from students into soldiers, so it'd feel hollow if he was preaching about the safety of the children. But he lost his son in war, so maybe he could see similar circumstances as a justifiable reason to fight Cyclops. The biggest reason this wouldn't work is unless Cyclops was eating babies, I can't see Cable going against his father. You had the first year or two of Cable's appearances in the Marvel Universe where he and Cyclops didn't get along, but by the time you got to this point, they were pretty close. As close as you can be with your post-middle-aged son you sent to the future to save from a robot virus. If you were building up tension between them for a while, maybe it could work, but in 5 issues, I don't think any writer could sell that. The only reason I entertained this idea was because I thought it'd be interesting to return to that caustic relationship from the early 90s, but it'd be so difficult to organically get there, this one would probably work as well as Wolverine. But my favorite choice, y'all ready for this? Emma Frost. Yes, she and Cyclops have been in a steady romantic relationship for about 7 years by this point, so you might think this wouldn't work. But since the mid-1990s, when Emma first became an ally to the X-Men, her defining characteristic was her love for her students. Yes, she's ruthless and mean-spirited. You wouldn't expect anything else from a former supervillain. But her genuine love and willingness to do anything for the kids in her charge after the death of the Hellions, that is an interesting take on the character. In the X-Men Regenesis one-shot following Schism, Emma wanted to go with Logan back to the school. That's how much she loves teaching. Not only seeing Scott willingly throw kids into battle even more than the X-Men already do, but also seeing him allow and condone Oya committing murder. Based on how much Emma built her identity around being a teacher, that should be enough to break her devotion to Scott. The event could end the same as it did, with half the X-Men going to New York to build a school. If I want to get self-referential, I could call back to my video on Rick Remender's Uncanny X-Force run, where Cyclops fired Wolverine. Maybe Emma isn't sure if Kitty Pryde and Rachel Summers would follow her to build a better future for the kids, but if Emma extends an olive branch to Logan, you can be the face of this school. They'll follow you. I just want to teach and help them. With how power-hungry Emma was in her Hellfire Club days, this would show she's not returning to the dark side by splitting from Cyclops. She's willing to live in a shack if it means helping these students. This way, you could still do the Wolverine and the X-Men series I love so much, with minimal changes to that run. As far as the implications this would have, the biggest thing would be Emma no longer being one of the Phoenix Five in Avengers vs. X-Men, and not being one of Cyclops' outlaw X-Men during Brian Michael Bendis' all-new and Uncanny X-Men runs. I don't think this would be a big deal, as she didn't have very much plot relevance in those stories. And just a few years later, all the X-Men were hanging out again anyway, so you could still get Emma where she is now if you had her as Cyclops' enemy in Schism without changing very much in between then and now. So that's what I would have done with X-Men Schism. You could still get the desired aftermath of this with Wolverine heading up a school, with Emma in the background helping run things, and this story would make more sense by itself. But what did you guys think? Let me know, and I'll be doing some other videos in the future. So until then, have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.